PMDD is actually a problem in my brain. So I've been coming across a lot of posts recently about the new research linking PMDD to early childhood trauma. And as a scientist who has PMDD, I had a strong reaction to this. Honestly, that reaction is probably a lot to do with my own experiences with not being believed or understood when seeking help. Medical professionals often tried to misdiagnose me with bipolar, borderline personality disorder, anxiety or depression, everything except PMDD. So when I see this trauma narrative emerging and gaining traction, it feels like we're at risk of repeating the same story just with a different label. Instead of being told you're unstable, women with PMDD are now going to be told, oh, this is just unresolved trauma. Or worse, having it treated like some kind of subtype of PTSD. Let's talk about this because the narrative might sound quite empowering and insightful at first, but it can actually be misleading. The claim is that women with PMDD often have a history of childhood trauma, things like emotional neglect, abuse, or growing up in a chaotic home. And that trauma is what causes the disorder to develop. And to be fair, there is evidence that early childhood trauma is linked to a higher risk of PMDD. One study found that women with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences were more than twice as likely to meet the criteria for PMDD. Other research shows that trauma-exposed PMDD patients tend to have more intense mood swings, heightened stress responses, and greater emotional reactivity in the luteal phase. But here's where I push back. We have decades of research showing that PMDD is, first and foremost, a biological disorder of the brain. A disorder where the brain overreacts to normal hormonal changes during the menstrual cycle. Women with PMDD don't have abnormal hormone levels. Our hormones are totally normal. It's our brains that respond differently to these hormone levels and changes. In one landmark study, researchers suppressed ovarian hormones and the PMDD symptoms vanished. When they reintroduced estrogen and progesterone, the symptoms came straight back, but only in the women with PMDD. That's not trauma, it's a neurobiological sensitivity. We're talking about the differences in the GABA and serotonin systems in the brain, in hormone receptor gene expression, and in brain regions like in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Your amygdala is responsible for your emotional reactions, and your prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, is responsible for cognition and for decision making. I read a research paper that absolutely blew my mind because it was talking about how they have found evidence that in women with PMDD, the way that your prefrontal cortex controls your amygdala in what is known as a top-down mechanism is actually reduced in people with PMDD, so that it's so much more easy to go into an emotional spiral if you have PMDD because your emotional responses start in your amygdala, but your prefrontal cortex is literally unable to control these emotions and to get you out of this emotional state, which just makes it so much more difficult to calm down and can lead to things spiraling out of control. And for me, reading this was game-changing because I've always beat myself up so much for getting triggered emotionally and then not being able to get out of it all and just going down a spiral and not feeling like any of my cognitive thoughts like this is okay, it's fine, why am I so upset, it's not that important. None of this actually seems to make a difference to the way that I feel, and it's so validated by this mechanism that they have shown in scientific studies is true. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I loved reading that because it just validated me and made me feel a lot less bad about myself. Like, it makes me feel a lot more accepting of myself and the way that I react to things, because it is actually a problem in my brain, and it isn't just that I'm some kind of weak person who's oversensitive and somehow that's like my fault. So it's not your fault. Back to what I was saying, we even have cellular evidence. Studies show that cells of women with PMDD respond differently to estrogen and progesterone at the molecular level compared to the standard person. This isn't just psychology, it's physiology. But, and this is important, biology and trauma aren't the opposites. Nature versus nurture isn't a black and white thing. In fact, trauma can even be inherited through a process called epigenetic transmission. Stress and trauma experienced by parents, especially mothers, can change the way the genes are expressed in the children. So if your mother or grandmother or great-grandmother experienced intense stress, abuse, or even PMDD symptoms of their own, that could have literally shaped your nervous system before you were even born. But here's the thing, even that doesn't mean that trauma caused your PMDD. It just means that trauma may have helped set the stage for how it manifests. Now I want to go on another quick tangent about what trauma actually is, because I think the word gets thrown around in a really black and white way. We often assume trauma means abuse or violence or something completely devastating. But trauma is a spectrum. It doesn't necessarily need to be anything that bad. It's not about what happened. It's about how your nervous system interpreted that at the time. For a long time, I didn't think I had any childhood trauma whatsoever. I would have said I'd grown up in a safe, loving upbringing, which I did. But through working with a therapist who specializes in trauma, I realized that even something like moving to a different country at a young age could have disrupted my whole sense of safety and left an imprint in my mind to this day. Our brains are constantly forming patterns in childhood, and many of the emotional reactions we struggle with later in life are rooted in these very early and sometimes really surprisingly small experiences. So now I understand that most people have some level of unresolved emotional memory from their childhood. It's not about whether you had trauma or not, but it's about what your brain learned to do to protect you. Even though PMDD isn't caused by trauma, I found trauma-informed therapy, specifically coherence therapy, amazingly helpful for managing emotional intensity and reactivity that comes with my PMDD. This is where I think the trauma narrative gets dangerous, not because trauma isn't real or relevant, but because it oversimplifies it. We can end up with sweeping statements like PMDD is caused by trauma or ADHD is caused by trauma, as if trauma alone explains everything. Yes, trauma may influence how our brain functions. Yes, it can shape how our symptoms show up, but that doesn't mean trauma therapy alone will be able to resolve it. Especially not when you're dealing with a brain that has a genetic, hormonal, and neurochemical sensitivity. So here's my take. As someone living with PMDD and as someone who has studied hormones, PMDD is a real biologically rooted condition. Genetics and brain chemistry create the foundation. Trauma, whether experienced directly or indirectly through epigenetics, can shape how PMDD shows up. It can make emotional regulation even harder, especially in the luteal phase. But trauma alone is not the cause, which means the best way forward is a holistic treatment strategy, one that's biologically informed, trauma-aware, and deeply compassionate. By the way, if you have PMDD or you think you have PMDD and you're looking for some tools to help you, I am launching a beta round for my PMDD Reclaim program. It's completely free. I have included all of the tools that have helped me manage my own PMDD in my life, that have led me to be able to live a normal and happy life. And sure, my brain is still wired in a certain way that means that during the luteal phase, I react more easily to things, but I have strategies and methods to limit the impact of these on my life, be it the cutting edge planning methods and strategies for cyclical living, be it nutrition and health strategies for my whole cycle to prepare me as best as possible for my PMDD week, be it emotional tools for grounding and self-compassion, meditation, but most importantly, learning how to process the emotional triggers and the emotional responses that I did develop at a young age, to give myself more of a chance to avoid these kind of triggers that lead me to these strong emotional reactions in my PMDD phase. Just follow the link in my website to join for free. I'm Eleanor, and if this resonated with you, hit like and subscribe and share it with someone navigating PMDD. You deserve science-based support and a full spectrum approach to healing.